Irish keening traditions involve specialized female practitioners called Caoinead whistlers, who develop distinctive vocal techniques merging controlled breath manipulation with specific tonal patterns believed to guide souls through the afterlife's obstacles. Unlike conventional mourners, these women trained from childhood in secret vocal methods, learning to produce simultaneous dual tones, a fundamental drone accompanied by higher-pitched spirit calls. Historical accounts describe their performances as neither singing nor speaking, but something otherworldly between. These specialized mourners worked as itinerant practitioners traveling between communities when deaths occurred, commanding substantial payment for their services. Most intriguing was their liminal social position. They were prohibited from certain community activities and often lived in boundary areas between parishes. The whistlers employed specific vocal patterns, depending on the deceased's manner of death, with distinct sequences for illness, old age, drowning, or violent ends. The tradition persisted until the 1950s in remote Western Irish communities, with recordings of the last practitioners preserved in Irish National Archives, capturing an ancient vocal tradition that transformed grief into specialized supernatural communication. Among Siberia's Tungusic peoples, particularly the Evenki and Udege tribes, the tradition of posthumous marriage addressed the spiritual danger posed by unmarried women who died before securing their ancestral position. These elaborate ceremonies involved selecting a symbolic groom, either a living volunteer or wooden effigy, for the deceased woman, who would be dressed in complete bridal attire including distinctive antler headdresses and specialized copper jewelry worn only by corpse brides. The ceremony required precise ritual elements. The bride's body was positioned seated rather than lying, facing the eastern sunrise, with specially crafted dolls representing future children placed at her feet. Most fascinating was the linguistic dimension. After the ceremony, the community was forbidden from speaking the woman's birth name, instead using only her married designation. Anthropological records document these practices, continuing into the early 20th century, with the last known ceremony performed in 1927. The tradition created complex spiritual kinship networks where living families maintained obligations to multiple deceased bride members, leaving offerings at their grave sites during specific astronomical alignments believed to thin the boundary between worlds. In Brazil's 18th century gold mining regions, Portuguese colonizers established sortes da morte, death lotteries, combining economic exploitation with religious control over indigenous populations. These macabre systems forced native communities to participate in quarterly drawings, where winners were sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies blending Catholic imagery with corrupted indigenous rituals. The practice originated in Minas Gerais province when colonial administrators discovered they could manipulate native spiritual beliefs about sacrificial honor while simultaneously reducing indigenous populations. Historical documents reveal the methodical organization. Colonial clerks maintained ledgers tracking participants and outcomes across multiple settlements. Most disturbing was the economic dimension. Wealthy colonists could purchase replacement tickets, transferring their selection risk to others, creating a grim marketplace of mortality. Surviving records indicate approximately 4,000 indigenous people died through these lotteries before the practice was outlawed in 1760 following papal intervention. Archaeological excavations have uncovered mass burial sites containing remains with distinctive ceremonial markings, providing physical evidence of this systematized atrocity that combined spiritual manipulation with colonial genocide. Following the failed 1809 Serbian uprising against Ottoman rule, imperial forces constructed Celikula Skull Tower near Niš, using the severed heads of defeated rebels as both construction material and psychological warfare. Ottoman commanders ordered the systematic decapitation of 952 fallen Serbian fighters, skinning and tanning their scalps before sending them to Constantinople as trophies. The skulls were embedded in a 15-foot tower using quicklime mortar in precise rows, with faces positioned outward toward roads approaching the city. Most disturbing was the architectural precision. The tower was designed with mathematical regularity, with exactly 56 skulls per row on all four sides, creating a perfect square column. The structure was intentionally left unroofed so birds could peck at remains, adding to the horror. Though intended to demoralize the Serbian population, the tower instead became a symbol of resistance. Today, 58 skulls remain in the preserved structure, which serves as both memorial and museum. Local tradition holds that visitors should touch the tower while silently naming the freedom they most value, honoring those who died defending theirs. Roman funeral culture spawned specialized grief markets, Mercatus Luctus, where professional mourners called praeficae sold their services based on elaborately tiered pricing structures. These highly trained performers, typically former slaves or lower-class women, developed distinctive wailing techniques and specialized in different emotional displays. Clients selected specific performance packages: lacrimae, quiet weeping; planctus, chest-beating laments; or the premium capillos genasque laniar, hair-tearing and face-scratching displays. Elite funerals employed dozens of praeficae organized in choreographed groups. Most fascinating was the commercial infrastructure supporting this profession. Specialized training schools operated in Rome's Subura district, and performance contracts specified exact duration and intensity of mourning displays. Archaeological evidence includes grief contracts preserved on wax tablets, detailing payment terms and performance requirements. The profession was simultaneously respected for its ritual importance yet socially marginalized, with practitioners forbidden from participating in certain civic functions. These markets transform private grief into public performance, commodifying emotional expression in ways strikingly relevant to modern conversations about authenticity and emotional labor. Norse settlers in Greenland, 986 to 1450 CE, developed a unique funeral tradition combining Viking ship burial with adaptation to their harsh Arctic environment. Unlike traditional Viking ship burials where vessels were interred underground, Greenland's frozen soil made excavation impossible, leading to drift burials. The deceased were placed in small, specially constructed funeral boats with grave goods reflecting their status: weapons for warriors, weaving tools for women, miniature toys for children. These vessels were launched into Davis Strait during specific tidal conditions and prevailing winds believed to guide spirits to Valhalla. Archaeological evidence from coastal excavations reveals specialized boat-building sites dedicated solely to constructing these funerary vessels, with distinctive shallow drafts and ceremonial carvings. Most fascinating is how the practice evolved over generations. As Norse settlements struggled, early boats contained lavish grave goods, while later periods show increasingly sparse offerings, tracking the colony's gradual decline. The tradition represents a remarkable cultural adaptation, transforming practical challenges into spiritual significance as settlers maintained homeland traditions in an unforgiving environment. In 16th century Hungarian villages, suspected witches faced posthumous prosecution through elaborate corpse trials that combined legal procedure with spiritual ritual. When unexplained deaths or calamities struck communities, recently deceased individuals suspected of witchcraft were exhumed and subjected to formal court proceedings. These macabre trials featured appointed defense advocates arguing against prosecutors before village magistrates and clergy. The corpse itself served as central evidence, with specific tests performed. Bodies that remained unusually flexible or produced fluid when pressed were considered proof of guilt. Convicted corpses received specific punishments designed to neutralize their malevolent influence, including reburial at crossroads with stakes through the heart, decapitation with the head positioned between the feet, or complete cremation with ashes scattered in running water. Historical records document over 140 such trials between 1520 and 1690. Most disturbing was the careful documentation. Court scribes maintained detailed trial records including testimony from the accused, typically obtained through questionable spiritual intermediaries who claimed to channel the dead defendant's responses during proceedings. Before Tasmania's indigenous population faced near extinction through colonial violence, they practiced an extraordinary funerary tradition involving intricately crafted death masks. These masks, created from a mixture of ochre, animal fat, and plant fibers, were molded directly on the deceased's face during a 3-day ceremony called Mangana. The mask captured exact facial features, but incorporated symbolic elements representing the person's totemic affiliations and social role. Most remarkable was the belief that the mask contained the deceased's Nunina, spirit essence, allowing controlled communication with the departed during seasonal ceremonies. British colonizers collected dozens of these masks in the 1830s Kralfidur and Itinguris, sending them to European museums where they remain today, separated from their cultural context. The last authenticated mask was created in 1856, just before traditional practices were violently suppressed. Modern Tasmanian Aboriginal communities are now seeking repatriation of these sacred objects, believing the ancestral spirits remain trapped within the masks, unable to complete their spiritual journey until properly honored according to traditional law. Beyond the famous terracotta warriors, several Chinese dynasties practiced actual human sacrifices to create ghost armies for imperial tombs. Archaeological evidence from Shang and early Zhou dynasty tombs, 1600 to 1000 BCE, reveals systematic sacrifices where hundreds of soldiers were buried in precise military formations surrounding royal chambers. These warriors were ritually executed during elaborate ceremonies, typically by controlled bleeding rather than violent deaths, to preserve their physical integrity for afterlife service. Excavations have uncovered soldiers buried with weapons literally fused to their skeletal hands, indicating they were positioned while dying. Most disturbing are the defensive formations around tomb entrances, suggesting these men were strategically positioned to repel supernatural rather than physical intruders. Chemical analysis of remains indicates some warriors consume specific hallucinogenic compounds before death, possibly to facilitate their transition to spiritual guardians. These ghost armies represent one of history's largest organized sacrificial systems, creating a supernatural security force serving emperors beyond death. Across medieval alpine communities, elaborate bell-ringing protocols announced deaths through complex acoustic codes that conveyed detailed information about the deceased. These Totengeläut, death peals, utilize specific combinations of the church's bells. Tenor bells for men, treble for women, alternating patterns for children. The duration, rhythm, and sequence precisely communicated the deceased's age, social standing, and manner of death. A sudden death received urgent, rapid peals, while an elder's passing warranted dignified, measured tones. Bell ringers trained for years to master these intricate death announcements, with mistakes considered dangerous omens. The bells serve practical and supernatural purposes, summoning mourners while creating a protective sound barrier, preventing the deceased spirit from becoming disoriented during its journey to the afterlife. The tradition created a communal soundscape of mortality, where experienced villagers could interpret exact details of a death simply by listening to the distinctive bell patterns echoing through mountain valleys. Palermo's Capuchin catacombs house over 8,000 mummified remains, but most remarkable was the corpse keeper profession that emerged between 1599 and 1920. These specialized morticians developed proprietary mummification techniques. Bodies were desiccated in special chambers for 8 months before being washed with vinegar and stuffed with straw. Families paid annual maintenance fees for upkeep of their preserved relatives, with different price tiers, determining positioning and visibility within the catacombs. Corpse keepers performed regular grooming of mummies, replacing deteriorating clothing and adjusting poses to maintain lifelike appearances. Wealthy patrons could request special arrangements, couples positioned to face each other eternally, or groups arranged in family rooms. The practice created an uncanny community of the dead, with newer arrivals positioned according to social status and occupation. The most skilled keepers gained fame for achieving remarkably lifelike preservation, with some mummies appearing merely asleep centuries later. The tradition ceased only when public health laws prohibited the practice, leaving behind one of Europe's most extraordinary death collections. New England Puritans distributed specialized funeral tokens called memento mori pieces to mourners, creating a numismatic tradition unique to 17th century colonial America. These silver or pewter medallions, typically the size of modern quarters, featured intricate skull imagery, hourglass motifs, and Latin phrases like fugit hora, time flies, or memento mori, remember death. Wealthier families commissioned personalized versions with the deceased's initials and death date, produced by silversmiths like Jeremiah Dummer. Recipients were expected to carry these tokens daily as tactile reminders of mortality, with some pieces featuring small loops allowing them to be worn around the neck. Community elders would inspect congregants to ensure tokens were being properly carried. Colonial records indicate these pieces served as social currency. Possession of tokens from prominent families' funerals signified community standing. Archaeological excavations of Puritan burial grounds have uncovered dozens of these tokens, revealing sophisticated craftsmanship despite their morbid purpose, and demonstrating how death awareness permeated everyday colonial life. In the 1830s to 1880s London, Egyptian mummies became centerpieces of elite social gatherings where hosts invited guests to witness unrollings. These macabre spectacles typically occurred in private drawing rooms, with guests receiving embossed invitations, specifying dress codes and refreshments. The unwrapping followed a theatrical progression. Bandages removed systematically while experts narrated, revealing amulets and artifacts embedded within layers. Attendees received souvenir fragments of linen wrappings, sometimes containing toxic preservative compounds. Prominent surgeon Thomas Pettigrew conducted over 40 such unwrappings, becoming known as Mummy Pettigrew in London society. Most disturbing was the competitive nature. Hosts vied for specimens with unusual preservation or high status, paying premium prices to antiquities dealers. The practice declined after discoveries that participants suffered mysterious respiratory ailments now attributed to ancient fungal spores and chemical preservatives released during unwrappings. These gatherings represent the bizarre intersection of archaeological interest, colonial exploitation, and Victorian death fascination that treated human remains as entertainment. During Japan's Edo period, 1603 to 1868, the composition of jisei, death poems, became a profound cultural practice among samurai, nobles, and Zen practitioners. These final verses, typically 31 syllables, following the traditional tanka form, were composed moments before death, whether by natural causes. Masters spent decades refining these concise expressions of mortality, aiming to distill their entire philosophical outlook into a single, perfect verse. Historical records preserve hundreds of authentic jisei, including those from famous swordsmen like Asano Naganori, whose poem preceded the events inspiring the legendary 47 Ronin tale. Warriors facing execution would request brush and paper from their captors as a final courtesy. The poems rarely expressed fear or regret, instead embracing impermanence through natural imagery, cherry blossoms, autumn leaves, and moonlight, serving as metaphors for life's transience. The practice created extraordinary psychological pressure, as a person's final poem was believed to reveal their true character and spiritual attainment. Taiwan's ghost marriage tradition, known as Ming-hun, continues into modern times as families arrange matrimonial unions between deceased unmarried women and living or deceased grooms. These elaborate ceremonies involve professional matchmakers specializing in afterlife arrangements, who consider social status, zodiac compatibility, and birth years, just as with living marriages. Special mediators communicate with spirits through divination to secure consent. The deceased bride receives a traditional dowry, including paper replicas of household items, clothing, and currency that's ritually burned for spiritual transfer. After the ceremony, the bride's tablet joins the groom's family altar, ensuring ancestral worship and preventing her restless spirit from causing misfortune. Most intriguing is the incorporation of modern elements, Some families provide paper smartphones, luxury cars, and designer goods for their deceased daughters. The practice increased following major disasters like earthquakes that claimed young lives, with matchmakers reporting hundreds of arrangements annually in rural regions. In Georgian England, a macabre economy thrived around mortality. When impoverished families couldn't afford burial costs, typically 3 to 5 shillings equivalent to several days' wages, the deceased were subjected to cadaver auctions held in tavern back rooms. Medical schools dispatched agents called resurrection men to bid on fresh corpses, assessing specimens for educational value. Auctioneers highlighted desirable features like unusual physical attributes or intact disease manifestations. Families often watched helplessly as relatives were sold, receiving meager compensation that rarely covered funeral expenses. The auctions created a horrifying hierarchy where bodies with rare medical conditions fetched premium prices. Parliament's 1832 Anatomy Act attempted to regulate this practice by redirecting unclaimed workhouse bodies to medical schools, but clandestine auctions continued in poorer districts until the 1870s. The practice created lasting trauma in working-class communities where being sold to the doctors became a dreaded fate worse than death itself. Since the 1700s, Hallstatt's cemetery space constraints led to an extraordinary tradition. After 10 to 12 years of burial, remains were exhumed, skulls meticulously cleaned with bleach, sun-dried, and painted with elaborate floral designs, family names, and death dates. These decorated skulls, over 1,200 in total, were arranged in the bone house, according to family groupings. The paintings weren't merely decorative but contained symbolic elements. Roses represented love, laurels, respect, ivy, eternal life. Specialized skull painters passed techniques through generations, developing distinctive artistic styles recognizable to locals. Families would visit these painted skulls on All Souls, lighting candles and reciting prayers beside their ancestors' remains. The practice continued until the 1960s, with the most recent skull added in 1995 by special request. The vibrant skull collection represents one of Europe's most unique approaches to maintaining ancestral connections beyond death. In West Africa's silent trade, merchants exchange goods without face-to-face interaction, leaving items at designated locations and retreating before counterparties arrived. What's lesser known is the spiritual dimension. Traders left specific offerings for ancestral spirits, believed to guard these sacred commercial grounds. These silent mourners required appeasement through small sacrifices of kola nuts, palm wine, or ceremonial beads. According to oral histories, traders who neglected these offerings suffered mysterious calamities, from sudden illness to devastating trade losses. The spirits were believed to physically manifest as mist or shadows during twilight hours. Some coastal communities maintained dedicated spirit shelters at trade sites where specialized spiritual intermediaries would commune with ancestor guardians, ensuring favorable exchanges. These practices created an intricate spiritual economy operating alongside the material one, where deceased relatives continued participating in commerce long after death.